Hi everyone, welcome to the Asian Voting Blog Roundtable discussion. We're talking about why Asians and Asian voting is so important in today's election. We are, a bunch of youth coming together from the whole Asian diaspora and really just coming to you to talk about what we're thinking about and why it's so important to use your voice to vote and to be politically active in today's world. So we're going to start off with some intros. So my name is Ria Goyle. I'd say I'm a youth activist and intersectional feminist. I'm really passionate about racial inequality, gender inequality, and kind of inequality in general. So I'm going to hand it off to Aria Young.
Hi everyone, I'm Aria. I'm currently an NYU freshman. Me and Ria are the co-founders of Asians Lead, and I've been a youth activist and intersectional feminist for a couple of years, and I'm super excited for this discussion.
Okay, Linny.
Hi, so I know my name, it says Antolin, but most of you guys will also know me as Linny. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm from California. I think my biggest passions would probably be in reproductive justice and menstrual equity. That's where a lot of my work is done in terms of advocacy. And yeah, I'm also a feminist and I care a lot about women's rights and gender equality. And I'll pass it off to William.
So hi, my name is William. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm born and raised in New York City, and I'm really passionate about educational equity and racial equity and youth equity, and I'm really excited to be here.
And Mira.
Hi, my name is Mira. I'm from New Jersey. I'm a junior in high school, and thanks to Ria and Aria for organizing this. I know Ria from a Girl Up Summit, and I like to consider myself politically engaged and trying to do my part and of educating myself and others around me to be politically engaged, but also, involved in issues that matter to me.
Perfect. And Disha.
Hi, I'm Disha. I'm from Georgia, and I do a lot of my work in youth empowerment and working with helping teens start their own projects and really letting them use their voice and give them a platform.
Perfect. So now that you know all of us, I guess we can get started. So our first topic is kind of going to be addressing the disparities in the Asian community. Why aren't we showing up to the polls, or why aren't we showing up in big numbers? And what's really stopping us from moving forward? I guess I'm going to pass it on to Will, if he's still here, to start off, because me and Will have been working on a voting project called the Asian Voting Block, and we've been discussing ways to bridge this divide. So Will wants to start talking about that.
Definitely. So sorry, I had to step away for a second, but I think there's so many issues to the Asian voting bloc and why so many Asian Americans don't come out to polls and vote. And I really think that the biggest reason why is that there's not a lot of efforts or a lot of education within the Asian American community when it comes to voting and elections and politics. And I feel like that there's such a strong stigma against us, and it's not our fault. It's not that we don't want to, it's just that our current politicians and officials don't divert efforts towards the Asian American communities to do outreach and support and voter registration and all these topics. And so the lack of education and lack of resources for our community really boils down to this issue.
Yeah. So I think some issues that we've really identified, I mean, one, there are no efforts to reach out to the Asian community, like Will said. My parents have been citizens where, we come from India, and no phone calls, no phone banking, no outreach to the Asian community, no mail, nothing. So how are your constituents going to know about their candidates without any information? So this lack of information is definitely apparent, and I think is the number one thing that's kind of not allowing, in a sense, the Asian community to come out and vote. So that's number one. Number two is honestly the model minority myth. People assume that Asians don't want to get politically involved, don't want to take that next step, and we're just going to be kind of sitting around and not doing anything. So I know those two things are really, really prevalent. And I mean, the third thing, if there are any voting resources or anything really coming out from the government or candidates, they're not available in Asian languages. I mean, you're lucky if you see them in Chinese or Hindi, but we need to recognize that what Asians mean is the Asian diaspora. And we don't recognize that a lot of the times. The Asian diaspora is huge. There are so many ethnicities that fall under this Asian diaspora, and we don't recognize that. So that's what we need to do, moving forward, have these resources available. I mean, online makes things so easy to click a button and you can kind of have a translator or whatever it might be. So to me, I think those are the three main issues. Ari, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, sure. And I was just thinking, like, it's not just that politicians don't reach out to Asian voters, it's also the fact that there are no Asian politicians or there is no Asian representation in the whole political arena from, political officials to voters. So I think it's just a vicious cycle because when Asians don't see themselves represented in government, they don't want to get involved. And as many Asians as there are that don't want to get involved, then we don't have to pull to promote Asian candidates. So I really think political education is really important. Just overall advocacy and encouragement for Asians to participate and get involved in politics is really important, especially in schools. I think we need to just overall promote Asian leadership in all kinds of areas, and really break that Asian stereotypes of us being only doctors and business people. So yeah.
Definitely. And we can make this very, open. So whoever wants to go next can go next. I don't have to call on anyone. So.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to sort of circle back on what Ria said about the language barriers. I think that in my community or in the Asian communities around where I live, it's very difficult to find one that is not biased in a way. And I think because a lot of newspapers or news anchors do have some source of bias in it that are very skewed to the right, I think that a lot of my relatives and a lot of the people in my community are being fed information that isn't completely just fact. And I think it's a very big problem because in a lot of communities, things are spread by word of mouth. And I think just because of that in itself, a lot of news anchors that are completely biased can be made really, really popular, even though we don't ever fact check them. I think there's that problem as well. I think a lot of people in our community don't go lengths to fact check their news. And I think that is another huge issue. Not in terms of just, getting out to vote, but more of just being educated about voting.
And also, I think news coverage is also like a factor that contributes to the disparity. Like you almost don't see any Asian related issues, political issues covered by news. I think when Andrew Yang was running, his media coverage was way less than other candidates. And even when the media does cover him, he's labeled as the Asian candidate. Like nobody cares about his policies and stuff. So definitely, I think from the media perspective, there's also a lot that we can do.
Yeah, and I mean, circling back to your point, when we do have media coverage, it's not accurate or it's biased, like Lenny was saying. When Andrew Yang was running, a lot of times they'd spell his name wrong or they wouldn't take him seriously as a candidate. So that goes to show how even if there is Asian representation, it's not accurate representation or it's not being taken seriously. And I mean, what does that mean for future Asian candidates? Would they want to run because they don't want to be under ridicule? So what does that mean in the future? How are we going to start making more candidates and making more representation for the Asian community? And I mean, that again, circling back is education. That's the only way to do it. And so many immigrants and so many people from the Asian community are coming to this country, and yet their children who are being brought up in this country don't get educated on their parents' traditions, values, history, culture. So where are they learning about where they came from? I mean, I was raised in America, born and raised, and I probably had 2 weeks of Asian history in my entire, and I'm a senior in high school. So to me, that's just jarring, because if I didn't go out and, go the extra step to actually educate myself about my community, my culture, my traditions, or if my parents didn't do that for me, then I have none of that. I'm suppressing my Asian culture. And then why would I want to embrace that moving forward? So I think that's kind of the question we're inherently, inscribing in people's minds. And then we have no representation because of that.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, Ria. I live in a town where our student population is 40% Asian. And then after that, there's also a large population of other people of other backgrounds. And I moved to this town when I was in 6th grade, but going forward, I'm a junior now. We've had so much coverage of US history, of other cultures, which I agree is important, but I don't think I've had enough or nearly as much importance on Asian American and Asian culture and education in general. And it is jarring, like you said, and a little bit concerning, because I've been brought up with parents who are really embracing and have taught me about my culture from a young age, but it makes me question, like, if they hadn't, and if I didn't have so much family here who was able to do that, would I not be as proud, as embracing, and engaged in my community as I am. And I don't want my children to grow up in this country not knowing where I'm from or where my family's from, just because there isn't that education. It's not a good reason, And then going back to voting, if we're not learning where we come from, how are we supposed to know how our candidates are going to do, what it takes to educate us, how to be involved in our communities? So it's all interconnected. And I think someone mentioned it starts from education from a young age, not just of candidates in general or political parties, but just of politics, of issues, and education. Once you educate people, they can make their own choice. It's not about who to vote for, but it's about being engaged, period.
Definitely. And I think we need accurate education at that. Those 2 weeks that, I did learn about Asian history, it was inaccurate. There were dates that were wrong. There were values and whatever that were wrong. And so I had to go up to my teacher and say, hey, like, this isn't right. But what if someone doesn't know that? They're learning wrong things about their culture. It's not accurate, and it's being taught by teachers that don't look like them. So that's another thing. And I mean, if they don't know about the issues that affect them as a community, moving forward when they are voters, they won't know what's affecting them as a community and what they need to see in their candidates. So, yeah.
And again, I think that really goes back to electing Asians into the government or promoting Asians into the administration level, because to solve that Eurocentric history education problem, it's really all we need is Asians in positions of power, or Asians, in those leadership positions, who can say, okay, let's write an Asian history AP course. All it takes is just that, but we don't have those people, we don't have those representation in government. And I think that's really the issue. So it's like a vicious cycle. Like because we don't educate Asians, we don't have enough candidates, and because we don't have candidates, Asians are not getting educated enough.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And I think there's a huge stigma within the Asian community with putting Asians in government positions. I know growing up that my parents were super apolitical, and I kind of didn't know that much about it. And so they had different focuses, I would say. I think I feel like our generation, at least, or all of us sitting here today, are I think we're all people who really believe in, justice for all or human rights. We're all very focused around those causes. But if you think about it in terms of our parents' generation, they were like immigrants, most of our parents, or some, mine were at least, from Asia. And so because of that, they were more focused, on putting food on the table, making money, and all of these things, like the necessities of life. And I think because of that, in a way, they don't care as much about some of these pressing issues within our government and society. And I think because of that, that kind of like, bleeds into our generation, because our parents, they're such big parts of our lives. They're who we grew up with. And so because of that, it's just, we might not, even the children, I think that's why our community is just so apolitical. But at the same time, I think if you look on the other end of the spectrum, there's people who have, immense privilege. I think there's Asians out there who do, make a lot of money and are well off. And so I feel like they, at the same time, I feel like don't care enough. I think some people, it's like, you have both ends of the spectrum. And I think because of that, I think that's why our community isn't as active as others.
I actually want to speak to that a little bit. I think when you say that sometimes some Asian American individuals don't care enough, I feel like it also just goes back to education, because oftentimes we don't care about it because we're not educated about it. I know at my school specifically, I think our school is 50% Asian American. We have a 50% Asian American student body, but oftentimes I speak to a lot of the students there. They don't have a strong interest in politics or elections or voting or voter registration or anything about that matter. And so it all boils down to education, because we're not given the education about not only politics, but our own history. And oftentimes when we get the information about our own history, about the Asian American history and Asian history, we not only have to learn about it through those 2-week classes, but we have to learn about it through affinity groups, by joining other organizations. But why do we have to join other organizations to learn about our cultures and identities? I feel like that it should already be implemented in our education.
And I think that also goes back to the concept or the narrative of the perpetual foreigner status. I think, at least from my experience, the town where I come from, I went to high school in a very predominantly white Catholic school, a very conservative town, where I think people are just not ready to accept an Asian politician, or even they fundamentally do not think that Asians are considered Americans. They can call you Asian Americans, but they don't think that you can be as involved in American politics as white people. And I think the fact that that's still an issue, and the fact that us or a lot of our parents are still immigrants, it just really adds to the issue, that Asians are kind of prevented by the society from participating in politics.
And I'd also like to add that I feel like the Asian community feels like it's not okay to cause disruption because we've been pushed down for such a long time within, like, oh, having to fit in, having to assimilate with everyone else, and reaching out. And that's kind of like a stigma because, like, I asked my mom, I was like, hey, can you check with your friends to make sure they're all registered to vote? And she was like, well, I don't exactly know if I feel comfortable doing that. And I think it's having those harder conversations is really what our generation needs to push, to really break that stigma and say it's okay to cause disruption because we need to do it now.
Definitely. I think that kind of the education that we do get, right, whether that they be 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months, we've only learned about the bad things. I've learned about Pearl Harbor, and there's so much stress on that, right? It doesn't cover the Asian diaspora. So being uncomfortable is what we're used to. But now we need to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. That's what we need to do moving forward. We need to start causing those disruptions. We need to start doing the things that make us cringe a little, but that's progress. That's what change means. And so I think that's what we need to do going forward. I'd like to move into the kind of next topic. I mean, why is it important for Asians in specific to vote, for all you? Why are we seen as politically inactive, and what can we do as a community to move forward into an era where it's normalized for Asian American politicians to run for office, and for Asian Americans to vote and take that initiative?
I think getting out the Asian American vote is really the first step of promoting Asian participation or representation in politics, because by encouraging people to vote, or by normalizing Asian voting, we're really pushing Asian Americans to get involved in politics, to get to learn their candidates and consider what their political beliefs are, consider what do they think is good for our country, and really to focus on the issues that will impact us. If certain politicians get elected, what does that mean for our community? What kind of candidates do we want? And I think getting out the Asian vote is really the first step to all these political issues facing our community.
I think what Ria was saying earlier is that, sorry, it was definitely not Ria. Someone said that people don't vote because they're not educated on what they're voting for. And I think that's really important. This election, I think that there's so much like on the line that people are educating themselves if they were on the line, or they're leaning to one way or another. Speaking from my family, my friends, and my network, I know that people I know who have been citizens of this country for many years and have been eligible to vote but haven't, it's because they didn't feel the need to, right? Like they're like, it's nothing's going to affect me. But at the end of the day, if it's not affecting you, it's affecting your neighbor, it's affecting your children, it's affecting someone. And that's really important. I know in my family, just because we're Asian doesn't mean everyone's thinking the same thing. Not everyone's voting the same way. People vote based on different things. Based on their money ideas, based on their race ideas. And I think that having those uncomfortable discussions and letting people hear what you think and why can help them understand more. I know that my grandparents are all citizens, and my grandfather has voted conservative in the past because of his beliefs on taxing and his beliefs, and my family is from India, so their ties to India and how government officials will, have a relationship with India. But having a discussion with him recently about chain migration and how that's how my entire family is in this country, and how the Trump administration doesn't necessarily support that, I think makes him really educated and concerned for the future of our country. Like, my family wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that. How can I support someone that believes in taking that away? So I think it comes down to having those uncomfortable conversations, even though it's so frustrating at times that, like, why don't you just get it? But we're doing our part, and I think it's also our part to help others understand that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's also really important to find community. I mean, like you said, discussing our politics, our views, what affects us fundamentally. Like you said, it's really about finding what affects us. It'll affect someone, some sort of policy, some sort of, thing that's going to be put out from an administration. So we need to find, hey, this is what really affects me fundamentally. This is why I'm here today, because of this X policy. And if something happens to that, this is what's at risk. Once we can come together, have these uncomfortable conversations, find this community, we can rise up as a generation, as a minority, again, as a community, finding those groups, finding those people. What we're doing today is important, because we might all be for Biden and Harris, but we still have differing views. We've still come from different backgrounds, despite having this one common thread of being Asian. So it's important for us to come together, share our views, talk about things that we might not agree on, and then maybe find that common ground and move forward in our very polarized, divided country. Because we're kind of looking at a civil war tomorrow. We don't know what's going to happen. And I don't know how well this conversation is going to age. But what's important is that we're coming together and we have these views. And whatever happens, we still have this fundamental need to make our country and our world better. And that's what we can build on. So to me, I think it's about finding community that supports you, that knows what you're talking about, that feels passionate about issues that you're passionate about. And that's how we can move forward and get the Asian vote out.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And to circle back on, why we need to be having these conversations is because I feel like again, many people don't know, many people don't have education. And it's important because, we have to have, I love the way Ria said it. We have to be comfortable having uncomfortable conversations, right? And I think it's because, yeah, there's just so many different perspectives that we all have. And I feel like most of the times we can sit here, we can talk all day, we can yell, we can scream, but sometimes if people don't listen, that's the issue. When we sit there and we don't listen to other people, and like I said, we all have such different views, I think that becomes a different problem, or a bigger problem. And like Ria said as well, she said that all of us, besides just being Asian, we all do see things a little bit differently. We all have different backgrounds and we sort of have different identities for that. And I believe that with all these perspectives, it's really important to just really sit down and listen to each other. And like I said, while we're doing that, we also need to be having these conversations. So if we really want to combat this issue, we can talk to anyone, talk to friends, relatives, family, and just find a community and say what's important to each other and why politics affects us and why we need to get out there to the polls and vote.
And to add to that, I really think Asian Americans definitely have some level of privilege compared to other minorities, and that we need to use that to help other communities and educate our parents and grandparents on how where we are now is affecting other people and what they can do to impact that too, because I think a lot of times they just see it in their bubble. Right, so it's then educating them again on bigger issues that other communities are facing, because we all have this common thread of being a minority and having faced some of these common struggles. So how can we tie that into convincing others to really get involved in using their voice to not only help their community, but to help the other minority communities as well?
I want to briefly talk about that because I feel like when you say that we're stuck in this bubble and that we're stuck with this one perspective and that we do have some privilege, I feel like that we need to be able to recognize that we have a unique perspective in society today because Asian Americans, we face privilege, but we also face discrimination. And oftentimes I feel like people don't want to speak out because they feel that their perspective is not valuable. But the Asian American perspective is so valuable because our perspective is so different and so unique. We have privilege, but we also have discrimination. And that oftentimes, when it comes to issues like racism and education, we do matter in it. It's not only a black and white issue, it's where everyone's involved in it.
Yeah, no, I really wanted to speak on that just as a personal experience. Sometimes I find myself having issues speaking about, I think, racism in general or any topic that kind of intersects with voting or just being politically aware because at times I feel like I'm privileged. Why am I, but at the same time, it's like, but I do experience some discrimination. So it's just because, we have this really unique perspective. Sometimes I feel like I get lost with that. Like, when is it okay to accept the fact that I'm privileged, but in what situations can I say that I'm discriminated against? I feel like that's just because that is such a really big dilemma. Some people do have problems speaking out about a lot of topics within politics. Like, I experience that a lot. I think as much as I'd love to speak out and be politically active, I sometimes stop myself and realize that this is not something I should say. Maybe this is for someone who is not me. I do have privilege and I do amplify voices, but maybe it's not for me to say. And because of that, I feel like that's that's not being addressed sometimes. And we need to really address that in order to get people to be politically active.
Yeah, I think it's really about finding that happy medium. Like everyone is saying, we are privileged to an extent. The model minority myth can be a gift, it can be a curse. A lot of society kind of expects us to be at this level, and that can be harmful. But at the same time, we're not as persecuted, not as discriminated against as other minorities. And in that sense, we need to be allies for other minorities moving forward. Their rights, our rights. All minorities are kind of one in our electoral system. I mean, we're all politically homeless. The electoral system is kind of designed to, and built against us. So in that sense, we need to rise together as minorities. But like everyone is saying, we are privileged. We are definitely privileged. And I think the only solution for that is to use our privilege to our advantage, to speak up about things that, we hold dear. Use this weird advantage, disadvantage, weird place that we're in to advocate and amplify the voices of others. And really use this specific advantage again to look through our political system with the lens of intersectionality. I mean, if you know me at all I can talk about is intersectionality. That's what I talk about. That's it, period. But it's so important. And it's even more important in the voting system in general, because like you kind of have to weigh what is more important to you, and look at everything, our political system, through intersectionality, through issues that affect you, your neighbor, your people, your circle, your network, and then go forward in deciding who you want to support and what you want to do, who you want to vote for. So yeah, I guess with that, do you want to all move forward and kind of talk about the issues that affect us as a minority, the Asian minority? Like, what do we need to look for? What do we need to be advocates for? Will, how about you start?
Sure. I honestly, this is not the best answer, but I honestly feel like we need to be advocates for everything, honestly, because everything does affect us. I can speak towards education because I do a lot of activism and education. And I feel like, especially in New York City, there's the divide, the segregational education that we have is so prominent and so evident in that we see white families, we see white students having a more privileged, better education than Black and Latinx students, Black and Latinx families. And the question of where Asian American students fit is still a question that we are in this middle ground and we're in this gray zone of, okay, are we considered privileged or are we considered on the lower end, on the more subordinate end when it comes to education? And so a topic like education, that's such a unique perspective. And that's something we should be advocating for because our perspective is so unique. And going back to a point that was said earlier, we need to be able to speak out because it may be uncomfortable to speak about the gray zone between these areas, but it's necessary in order to get this election heard by Asian Americans.
Definitely. I think I could rephrase the question and maybe what's important to all of you, 2 or 3 issues as Asian American potential voters, as current voters. What are you voting for? What's making you go out to the polls and being politically active? Lenny, if you want to take this question.
Yeah, of course. So I wanted to build off of what Will was saying about, education. I think that a big barrier to all of this would probably be racism within the Asian community. Because I'm not sure if it's present for, anyone else, but especially in my community, which is mostly, Vietnamese people. There's this kind of like anti-Blackness rhetoric kind of going around, and a lot of our parents, and I feel like people within that community are just racist toward other people. And I think that in order to really care about others and, the same idea of just your vote matters because it affects your neighbor, it affects the people around you, it affects your loved ones, that if we are able to kind of get rid of this racist sentiment and really care about others and know that what we vote for is ultimately affecting their lives as well, is a great way that we can sort of educate people and try to combat this issue.
And I think for me, immigration is a huge issue for me. I am in the States on F1 student visa. And this past summer, I don't know if y'all heard, but Trump passed a executive order banning international students from entering the States. And I was in the US, but I got really scared that I was going to get deported. And I don't think anybody, with legal identities in the United States should ever be worried about that. And even like we call them illegal immigrants, but really like who is there to say who's illegal? Like, so I really think we need a better system for documented and undocumented immigrants. I think our country in general needs to be more welcoming, and there should be a better system in place where people don't need to worry about their status, don't need to worry about if they can even go to the hospital if they're undocumented. I know somebody who is undocumented in the United States, and they've been here for like 3 years without going back to their home country because they were afraid that they won't be able to come back, and they couldn't go to the hospital even when they're sick because they are undocumented. And I just think there should be a better solution for those people, and especially in the Asian American community, we have so many immigrants. Most of our parents are immigrants, so just because some of us are born here and some of us are citizens, doesn't mean we are not a product of immigration. And I think we really need to keep that in mind when we're voting and getting ourselves involved in politics.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to your point about healthcare. Healthcare shouldn't be as big of an issue as it is, not just for Asian Americans, but for everyone. And I've been really lucky to have, my family's lucky enough to, have insurance and things like that and not have an issue with visiting doctors and such. But it's expensive. Like, I mean, we can afford it, but people can't. Within our communities, I know so many friends whose parents don't have physicals yearly as they should just because they're not on insurance or they can't afford it or it's not covered or their copay is too high. And that's just not an excuse really to minimize your health because our government officials aren't giving us the means necessary to do so, get access to those things. And it's scary, frankly, looking and seeing that like my friends can't go to the doctor when they're sick. So yeah, I think that's really important, as well as I think the climate crisis is very real, and we need to elect officials who are believe that and are working towards making some change and doing that fast. We don't have much time, as scary as that sounds. And that's not just specific to Asian voters, I think it's specific to everyone, but it's also an issue that I think is important.
Yeah, and I just want to share a quick personal thing about healthcare. I mean, someone in my family was suspected to have COVID, and of course we're taking preventative measures, and so that person went to get tested. And we're in a developed country. We're in the freaking United States. But my dad had to stand outside at 6:30 in the morning before the healthcare center opened for 2 hours in sleet and rain, and then wait another 2 hours before that person in my family could get tested. So for me, waiting 4 hours outside in the cold and rain just to get a preventative test for a global pandemic in the United States, it's just not okay. And I mean, hello, copay, everything, like insurance and all of that, it just costs a lot to take a test when it should be free, when we're in the middle of a pandemic, when everyone is going through hell and back. I mean, we are all sitting at home if we're privileged enough. If not, we're working, to make ends meet. And our country is in absolute despair, and people cannot get a COVID test. To me, I was just mad because there are people who are working every single day, putting themselves at risk, and they have to take those hours away from their minimum wage job just to get tested. And if they do if they test positive, there's more work and layoffs and everything that comes with that. So to me, the fact that we're in the United States means nothing. We are not a developed country in any sense, in my opinion, because we are not developed as people, as systems, as infrastructure. We just don't have it. And it goes against minorities. It goes against everyone. I mean, I live in a community that is mostly minorities. I'd say 90% minorities. It doesn't look that way on the surface, but I'll tell you it does. And to me, standing outside in the cold and rain for a COVID test for 4 hours is just not America. That's not the picture we put out there. We're like, oh, we're getting tested. It's so easy to get a test. No, it's not. It costs money to get a test. I mean, it costs $100 to get a COVID test, a rapid test, not the actual test. And so, yeah, I'm going off on it because I'm angry, because that's not how it should be. Healthcare should be accessible to all, and it's not. And that's something that is at stake for millions of Americans. in this election. And the fact that we're not worrying about it is terrible. And like Mira was saying, the environment, I mean, how is that a question anymore? We know that it's real. It's real, it's here. And if we're not doing anything about it, we'd be dumb. We are dumb as a country because we're not doing anything about it. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, and to add to that, how are we pushing down science when the facts are there, not only on just the climate crisis, but also with COVID, with also safety precautions not being pushed out? I just like to say there are so many people who would do exactly what Trump would say. However, the seriousness of everything, it just wasn't put out there. And I think that really infuriated me because I live in a very white community, and there's still kids who will tell me, "Oh, why are you wearing a mask? COVID's not real. I haven't gotten COVID yet." And that enrages me more than anything else that we're not pushing science first. We're not listening to the experts. We're not listening to the people who are literally studying to tell us what to do better. And having policies that go back those claims up are so important because we can listen to them talk on the news all day, but nothing is happening. Something needs to happen.
Just really quickly, I want to say as a country, we're all talk and no game. And I will say that again and again and again. We can say that we're the best in the world, that we have the best resources, we have all of this, but what are we actually doing? I mean, we're trillions of dollars in debt and no one gives anything about that. I mean, we are actually just terribly broken. And what are we doing about it? I mean, we're electing people that are making it worse. And I mean, sure, there has to be something good about every, political candidate. But what about all the bad? What about all the people who are suffering and dying, in the middle of a global pandemic? Why are we still not taking this seriously? I mean, developing countries have it better. I mean, my relatives are in India, and they can get a COVID test in 30 minutes. So the fact that India, who has an astronomically high population, can have that happen, and we in the United States have to wait 4 to 5 hours to get a screening, like a screening, the rapid screening. What are we doing? So that's kind of what I'm thinking. I mean, we're just not able to get anything done. We're having all of these conversations, that's really great, but where's the action?
No, I agree. And I think that one of the biggest kickstarters or the ways that we can get action to happen is through the government. I'm sorry about my dog, I apologize. But they've been barking like all 30 minutes, whatever. Anyways, but the the government, I think, has a big role in helping all of this happen. Regulating this whole, regulating COVID and everything. And we really need to, I think, refocus where we're putting our funding. That's what I'm voting for. Right now, I think the US has almost, I think it's it's almost $700 billion that all goes to the military. And I think even a fraction of that could be taken out for, social social reform, or it could be Medicare for all. Even a small percentage of that could pay for college for every person in the United States and get rid of billions of dollars of student debt. And I think just because we really need to refocus that in general, we could totally have this whole COVID thing under control. We could get people the testing they need. We can get all this to happen if we had just put the right government officials in place. We just needed to, that's why we need to vote. That's why we need to go out there and make our voice heard. It's because there are decisions such as these being made, but we have to be okay with it because it's the people that we decide to elect these officials. We put them in power, right? And so I think that's such an important thing to remind people in the upcoming election, that their vote will ultimately affect what's some of the future. What's the future of this COVID-19 pandemic? And I think so many other issues.
And really quick, I mean, I think we pride ourselves as a country in being representative. Every vote has a voice, every person has a voice. And that's true. We have to use it. And that's how our system was designed. But unfortunately, it goes against minorities. We are, as a society, as a minority, politically homeless. And I'll say it, we don't have a place in our electoral system. And so our representation isn't representative of who we are as a democracy, as a group of people. Yes, we're majority white, sure, in the United States, but everyone is an immigrant in this country, even the white people, so we need to value each other. We need to stop this polarization, and we need to come together to have true democracy. I think that's losing meaning, the word democracy in our country, because to an extent, and I'll say it out loud, we almost have a dictator. We're very close. The fact that he can possibly challenge a new president coming in, slide a non-dictator for me. So I think that goes to show how little democracy, like how little the word democracy has meaning, how little meaning there is to the word, and how, again, we need to come up, vote, and use our voice to make sure that it has meaning and give it back its meaning.
And as I said before, I think the youth voice is something that's really important to me, and we need a future for our country where our voices are just as important as everyone else's, and a candidate that cares about young people, our thoughts and our opinions, because we're the ones who are going to have to live with whatever they leave behind. And right now, I think a lot of us feel ignored and out of the conversation. And we've been pushing so hard to be a part of the conversation that I think with this new push, with this new light in government, maybe we might have that.
Yeah, and to all the Asian voters and potential voters out there, the Asian voting bloc, we grow every year by a lot. There is a huge Asian population in this country, and a lot of us every year are becoming voters. So we need to use those numbers to our advantage. If you go out there and vote for what you believe in as an Asian, we are winning as a minority. We are showing up as a minority, and then we have representation as a minority. So I think that just goes to show the power of your vote. And young people, if you're out there, use your vote. I think that's so important because our vote and our voting block is undermined a lot of the times, but we can switch that seat, to from red to blue, or from whatever you believe in. So yeah, if anyone has any thoughts on that. Okay. Well, I think this was really great. We got to focus on a lot of things that are going on in the Asian minority and why it's so important for all of us to come together and to show up to our polls, to be active and to voice our opinions in our community and use the specific, unique vantage point as Asians to move our electoral political system forward. So thank you all, Lenny, Aria, Mira, Disha, and William, for being on today. And we hopefully hope that you guys can go vote and we see a good outcome tomorrow. But if not, we will keep fighting, for what we believe in. And I will end it with that. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Ria, for organizing this. Thank you all for joining. Yeah.
Yeah, this is really great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so